Did you know that you have 76% of the genes of a banana? So did we all come from the banana? One of the professors walked onto the stage and spat in my face. Fury exploded. They were so angry. Some of my colleagues literally started foaming at the mouth. By the age of 12, I was militantly anti-God. I hated everything that had to do with God. I didn't like him. I was a complete and utter atheist. I was lecturing at our top university in the country with the highest rating in Africa, and I gave a lecture, and the audience divided into two as a consequence of the data which I presented. If it was just a question of science, you could get up and say to me, "Excuse me, what you are saying is not logical. Isn't more akin to a religion than to a science? Isn't it a belief system that is being attacked?" Well, I'm supposed to tell you why I have changed some of my views over my lifetime. And it's been a rough journey and an interesting journey, and I thought I could share a little bit about it. We're going to talk tonight about the creation. The earth is a witness. And can you believe the words that you have in the scripture which say, "in the beginning"? I mean, it's just 3 words, "in the beginning," but the next word is the problem. Because the next word is God. In the beginning, God. Now, that word God is plural. It's the word Elohim, and it's plural. And then it gets even more confusing because the plurality is talking with someone, because it says, "Let us," that's plural, isn't it? "Make man in our image." Okay, so who's he talking to and what's he talking about? So these are some of the things that you read there in the beginning of the scriptures. And are they true? Well, according to science, the story is not the same in the scientific literature as it is in that book. So which is which now? Which is myth? Which is truth? And it takes quite a journey in life to try and figure out some of these things. Now, I grew up in a very Christian home. My father was a Roman Catholic. My mother was a Lutheran. And I attended a German school in Africa. And it was mainly a Lutheran school, but the religious instruction that I received was more of a Catholic nature. So I got sort of a plethora of ideas in the beginning there, in the beginning. And then when I was about 10 years old, my mother got cancer. And she was a very stubborn lady. They gave her about 6 months to live, but she stretched it into 4 years. Now, those 4 years were quite tumultuous for me because in those days, there wasn't much of a connection between Catholicism and Lutheranism or Protestantism, and they were mutually condemning each other. And so as a little boy, I had to, in the religious instruction classes hear what was going to be the outcome of this issue. So if you didn't belong to the one religion or to the other religion, then in the thinking, you were lost. And if you were lost, well, then you went to the hot place. And there you suffered for all eternity. And as a little boy, I couldn't understand all of this. And so I became very antagonistic towards religion. And one day I actually tore up the catechism book in class when I was told again what the consequences were of the wrong choices of being born in the wrong place and the wrong time with the wrong background. And I tore up this catechism and I threw that at the instructing nun, and that put the cat amongst the pigeons. It didn't go well. I think I was about 10 years old at that stage. And so I was thrown out of class, And being a stubborn kid, I went and sat in the courtyard where the headmaster would see me. And the headmaster would ask me, "What are you doing out here, young man?" And I would say something to the equivalent of, "That witch threw me out." That didn't go down well either. And so I was commanded to go to the office. And in those days, corporal punishment was the way to go. So you would get 6 of the best. And this happened on a very frequent basis, at least once a week. And eventually, a lot of the teachers turned against me and thought I was a very unruly and very unreligious and very disgusting child. And so some of the others also threw me out, and particularly the German teacher who taught German. He threw me out as well. In fact, he would give me a good whack before he threw me out of his class. And so I had 2. I had a witch and I had a monster. And it's uncanny how this headmaster caught me every time and managed to modify my posterior on those occasions, which made me hate school. So I started to hate school, and I thought the best way to deal with this is to blow them up. And so I started studying science, and I went to the libraries and I studied science. And I took out every science book that I had in my room. I was about, 10 years old, I think, more or less, maybe going on 11. I had science books everywhere, and I had experiments going, and I was building telescopes, but I was particularly interested in how to blow up schools. So I studied how to make gunpowder and how to construct an exploding device, which I then very successfully did by going to one chemist after the other and trying to purchase some materials to construct this thing. And I wanted to test it, so I put it under a tree in a schoolyard, and it was a massive tree. It took about 3 or 4 kids to hold around it, and I blew this tree out of the earth, and I created a crater which was about 5 meters deep. And the thing took off like a rocket and ended on the rugby field. And I figured, the best way to deal with this is not to run away from the catastrophe, but run towards it. So when the people came running to see what was going on, I was right in the front and said, "What the heck happened here?" And so if nobody tells on me, well, it was me. It was I that was responsible for that. But in any case, theologically speaking, I was basically anti-God from about the age of 10. And by the age of 12, I was militantly anti-God. I hated everything that had to do with God. I didn't like him. And if he did exist, well, then he could see what he can do with himself, because as for me, there was no relationship. And so my father married again, and I had a stepmother that was like a fairy tale stepmother. You know how they are? They're very kind to the little kids. So I was not allowed to be at home. So they put me into hostels. Now, what hostels would they put me into? School hostels. I hated school with a passion. So I used to run away. I used to run into the forest, and they would have search parties looking for me. Now, we didn't have blue gums, but we had pine trees. So I'd climb up, and I would break down the pine cones, and if the teachers came, I would have a practice session as to whether I could hit them. And so the time came when they said that this boy is definitely not school material. He has to go to either some reformatory or some trade or something. But fortunately, I'm a very stubborn person. So if somebody said A, then I would do B. So when they said I'm no longer allowed to go to school, that's when I wanted to go to school. And so I ended up in a school that one of my uncles, who was also a headmaster at another school, but not prepared to take me into his school, I was too dangerous. I attended a very upper-class British school that had a lot of Jewish kids in it. Now, that didn't go down too well either because I was German. And so I got into conflict with them because they were kind of mean to me because I was German, and they compared me with the Reich and all kinds of stuff like that. So one day I modified the appearance of one of these kids, and that got me into serious trouble again. But fortunately, the headmaster was very savvy. And he figured out what was going on, and so he pretended to give me a thrashing, but he actually hit the back of his chair so that everybody would think that I had a thrashing, and I had to walk out pretending great pain, like this, more or less. And that turned my opinion somewhat, and I started liking academics. And long story short, I ended up in a university. I became a lecturer. Then I had got a doctorate, and I was a complete and utter atheist. Now, what does the word atheist mean? It means anti, or theist, against God. Now, I don't know whether you know, but science cannot allow a divine foot in the door. They publicly state so, because science and God, or the supernatural, are mutually exclusive. Now, the fact that you are an atheist doesn't mean that you don't believe anything. It means you can believe anything you want as long as there's no God, no personal God. All right, so I went down that rabbit hole, and through many occasions, amongst others, my dear wife, she was born into a family that was very much different to what I was born into. And her father was a serious student of the occult world. And so he went into occultism. Later, he went into the New Age movement. He actually was instrumental in starting the New Age movement in Africa, brought out magazines like Inner Space, and had communications through his second wife with spirit beings that used to appear. And he taught me many, many things. He taught me how to do out-of-body experiences, for example, which I was quite good at, and all kinds of things like that. Then I got interested into the machinations of how these people think, the ascended masters, Dwal-Kul, the whole New Age gambit, and got very much involved with that. There was a course that they were involved in, which was called a Course in Miracles, where you become like a Christ. You achieve the Christness in you, and you become like Christ. You can be a healer, you can be a this, and you can be a that. So I was pretty New Age. And then I went further down into this rabbit hole and eventually studied Blavatsky and Alice A. Bailey and Freemasonry, and what happens in Freemasonry as you go up the various degrees. And when you get to the 18th degree, you promise obedience or allegiance at least to someone called Apollyon. And if you think about that, that's a name that occurs in Revelation. And then I studied what happens there and what happens in the world and what happens on the political stage and who's who in the zoo and what happens at the United Nations. Then I studied the Temple of Understanding in the United Nations and the writings of Blavatsky and her successor, Alice A. Bailey. And the interesting thing is, it's pretty clear and very direct that eventually, once you go that route, you realized that there is a conflict between Scripture and the views of some of these organizations. And they are very blatantly Luciferian. So Lucifer becomes the light bearer, the true Son of God, and in the Temple of Understanding, the philosophy of the New Age, you find these things. So you have this Luciferian side on the one side, and Blavatsky is very clear about it, that God is actually the evil one, and Lucifer is the good one. So you have the yin-yang, and you go down terrible rabbit holes and study these things. And you wonder to yourself, why does the world system, why does it run on these philosophies? And why are they entrenched? And how are the religious systems involved? And you start studying into that, and then suddenly you find out that the spiritual guideline behind, let's say, the United Nations came from something that was called a ghostly guild, where they studied communications with spirit entities. And then you have the Jesuits involved, and you have Pierre Teilhard de Chardin being basically the father of the New Age movement, involved in all of these manifestations. You have the Parliament of World Religions, where you have the Vedic writings and all of these things mixed up, and you think to yourself, but this is weird. So many confusing ideas, and who is the Christ, and what is the Maitreya, and all of these issues. And I started studying into the Maitreya and what he was going to be and what he was going to do. And I started giving lectures, and I had an interesting experience. I was in Zurich, and I started lecturing on the issue of the New Age and of Maitreya and Dwalkul and all of these issues. And the Swiss were not into that. So half of the audience, please don't do that, it's not nice. Half of the audience got up and said, no, we're not going to listen to this rubbish. This is not true. And they walked out. It's very embarrassing. Did you know that? Very embarrassing. And as they were walking out, I was thinking to myself, okay, can I make this any plainer? I had all the evidences on the screen. And about 10 minutes later, they all came rushing back in. And they were shouting and screaming. And I said, what's going on? What's going on? And they said, Maitreya's here. Maitreya's here. And I said, what are you talking about? I was in a hall in Zurich. And apparently, right next door, there was a hotel where there was a public meeting with one of the representatives of Maitreya, and his name was Benjamin Cream. And he used to be overshadowed by Maitreya, take on the appearance of Maitreya and speak like Maitreya. And the people were ecstatic and running around saying, Maitreya is here, Maitreya is here. And then they came running back into my hall, and they sat down, and they thought, I'm not as crazy as I look. So these are some of the experiences in my life. So yes, I was an atheist. And then I got very interested in the various religions. So I studied the Bible from the front to the back, couldn't make head or tail of what it was saying, thought it was a nice fairy tale, etc., etc. Didn't really know what all of these beasts and funny things in the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation were, so I thought, okay, I'll study the Vedic writings. So I started studying them, went into the Eastern philosophies. So I've really been down all of those tracks. Then I thought, what about the Quran? And so I studied the Quran, and I nearly drove my poor wife nuts while I was studying the Quran. And I had all of these religious comparisons. And then finally, by some miraculous circumstances, somebody introduced me to biblical prophecy. Now, that was quite a game changer, because biblical prophecy is something that is totally unique. You don't find it in any writings. You don't find it in the Quran. You don't find it in the Vedic writings. You find stories. You find accounts, you find mythologies, you have wisdoms in there. Yes, there are all kinds of things like that. But prophecy, in other words, writing history in advance, is something that you don't find in any of the religious writings. It doesn't exist except in Scripture. Now, this was quite shocking to me because one of the prophecies that really struck me were the prophecies in the book of Daniel. And it's sort of a progression of information. It becomes more and more as you go on. So there's a blueprint, which is Daniel chapter 2. And then there's an expansion of that, which is Daniel chapter 7. And then there is another form of it, which is Daniel chapter 8 and 9. And then there is a prophecy as to the exact time when the Messiah would appear in history. And if you apply the rules, it came to the baptism of Christ. And I thought, well, this is weird. This is very strange. And especially the prophecy in Daniel chapter 7. I'm not going to deal with that. I'm going to talk about evolution. I'm getting there. Relax. I'm going to get there. So I thought, I have to find out whether this is true. Is this trickery? What is going on here? So I was playing squash with one of my theologian friends at the university where I was a lecturer. And I asked him about these things, and I asked him about prophecy. And he was a theologian. He should know, right? And he was a professor in Greek. And I said to him, well, what's going on here? And he says he doesn't have a clue. He doesn't have a clue. And I said, well, have you got any books that you can recommend? Where can one see if these things are so? Because this sounds fascinating to me. So he opened up the theological library to me, and I used to sit and study in the theological library. And lo and behold, I found that the scriptural presentation of history written in advance was stunningly accurate. Not like Nostradamus, where you have to guess what is he talking about, and what does this symbol mean, and what does that symbol mean. Scripture was very clear. Each symbol was carefully illustrated and explained as to what it means so that you can't apply it to the wrong thing. And so I was in this turmoil of mind. Could there be something in this book that was different to all the other religions that I've been studying? And why was the main character in the Scripture the opposite of the one that was being elevated by the elites and by the political systems in the world? What was going on here? There was something fishy. And I was involved in all of this thinking at the time, and I was presenting lectures on evolution to the medical school. And this was first-year medical students, young people. They're very brilliant because they get chosen to get into the medical school. You don't get into medical school if you're not an A+ student. And there I was talking about the evolution of the kidney. And a young girl has the arrogance, believe it, has the arrogance to get up, confront me in front of 400 students, and tell me she doesn't believe a word I'm saying. You don't do that at university. It's a no-no. And so I obliterated her off the face of the earth with scientific jargon, of course. And she sat down and she cried. And I thought, well done, that should shut her up for the rest of the year. I mean, you can't have the integrity and the knowledge of the lecturer being denigrated by a first-year student. Can you have that? And so I went back to my office, and guess what? I felt guilty because I had lambasted the poor child that she actually had, dissolved in tears. And I thought to myself, that's not nice. You're an arrogant idiot. Why did you do that? You could have told her in a nice way why you disagree with her. Why did you do it in such a terrible way? But it started something. It started a process. It started a process of thinking. Is that what I believe and what I stand for really so? Can it be corroborated or can it not be corroborated? And being involved with religion and with Catholicism and Protestantism and New Age movement and occultism and all of these things, I actually went and visited a priest. And I got acquainted with him. And when I wanted to discuss an issue of how do you deal with things that you do that are wrong or whatever, he was shopping. Now, this was very eye-opening to me because it made me think again. You see, in that system, in Catholicism, if you did something that was bothering your conscience, then how did you get rid of it? You went to a priest and you told him about it, and he said, "No, it's okay, you're absolved, you're ready, there you go." So I wasn't quite at that stage yet, but I sat there and one of the nuns told me he's gone shopping, and I wanted to talk to him. And the thoughts went through my head, now, what if this guy who is shopping is the one, according to that religious system, that is supposed to absolve you of whatever is wrong, and he's shopping, and you go outside and a bus rides over you? What happens then? Then you're not absolved, then you go, according to the system, to the hot place, which I didn't really envision in that way at that stage, but the whole system didn't make sense. Why can't you go directly? And I was sitting in this chapel, and there was a little chamber with a red light attached to it, a candle, a red candle burning, and that in Catholicism means that the consecrated host is there. Now, I thought about that for a while. Now, I know that the consecrated host in my entire youth was venerated, and I thought to myself, now, how does this work? I can't talk to it because it's a corpse. It's a host. It's a corpse. So I can't talk to it. I have to talk to a priest, but the priest is shopping. So I can't talk to the priest. Now, what if I go out here and a bus rides over me? What happens in that interim? How do you resolve this issue? This system can't work for everyone, because what if there is no priest around and you're stuck somewhere in the middle of nowhere? How does that work then? Who do you communicate with? I'm just trying to give you an idea that some of these things showed me that there's no logic. And I want to have a logical idea as to how things happen. So I started studying again from the beginning. In the beginning, God, Elohim. Now, who was he talking to? Let us make man in our image. So you jump to John chapter 1, and it says, in the beginning was the Word. Same words, in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. And then it has this strange verse which says, all things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. That's a bomber of a statement. All right, so who was the conversation with there in the beginning? There were at least two entities talking to each other. Let us make man in our image. And one, according to this paradigm, spoke the word, and everything came into existence. Now, come on, that's pathetic, don't you think so? That's pathetic. So you start thinking about these things and you say, but that doesn't make any sense. How does this work? So this must be a mythology. And then it gets worse. In 6 days, he made it. Now, come on, I'm a evolutionary scientist. I became a professor in zoology. I was also a professor of medical bioscience, so because a lot of my research was of a medical bioscience nature. And here I'm being told that the scripture says in 6 days, God, through speaking, created something out of nothing. That is totally pathetic. So I got to talking with someone, and they said, no, it happened like that. And I said, man, you're excuse me, you're an idiot. So he brought me a pile of books, this high. So I studied that pile of books. It was books on creation and how God did it and all of these things. And I gave them back to him and I said, I've never read so much rubbish in all my life. So he brought me another pile of books. And I went through those and gave them back to them, and he got angry with me. And he said to me, I don't have a problem with evolution. You have a problem with evolution, so you solve it. I'm not bringing you anything anymore. And off he went. And so I was stuck with a ball. And I thought, what am I going to do with this ball? And so I did an intolerable thing. I sat in my office one day and I said in a conversation to whatever was listening, I didn't know what it was, whether it was you were going to call it God or whether you were going to call it your conscience or your subconscious or consciousness or whatever you want to call it. I said, okay, if there is something wrong with the theory of evolution, then you better show me. You better show me. Because I hate being deceived. I hate being lied to. And so I went to, later that day, I went to our library at the university. And I went down the shelf on the phylogenies and I said, okay, which one am I going to take? And I saw a book on paleontology, which I'd read many times. And I thought, I'm going to take that one. So I took the book, signed it out, and went back to my office. And a colleague stops me in the passage. I've got the book under my arm. He can't possibly know what's under my arm. And he can't possibly know what he tells me next. He says to me, the book that you've got under your arm, there's a new edition that hasn't been unpacked. It's in the boxes in the back of the library. Excuse me, how would he know? So I said, what? And he said, no, there's a new edition of that book. So I turned around, went back into the library, asked the librarian, have any new books comes in? She says, yeah, there's some boxes in the back. So I went into the back. I was a lecturer. I was entitled to do that. I opened the boxes. I packed them up. And sure enough, here was a new edition of this very book. So I took it out. Now I had two books. What are we going to do now? Give the one back, take the new one. What was I going to do? I took them both. So I took them to my office and I started reading them both at the same time. And I was stunned because the new edition would gloss over some of the statements of the old edition that seemed to be more honest. So something was being covered in scientific jargon. Long story short, I was doing lectures on genetics at the time, and I was mulling over how these things work. And I came to the point where I had a number of questions and no answers. Just a number of questions. And I'm going to talk about the questions tonight. So I thought, all right, how am I going to deal with these questions? At the university, we had a postgraduate class called the discussion class, which dealt with evolution and how the process of evolution took place, how it evolved, how it happened, whether it was fast, whether it was slow, all of these questions, or what was the nature of the changes, etc. And this class was attended to by lecturers, professors, and postgraduate students. So it was a smaller forum, probably about, I would say, maximum 40 people, and we would have a lively discussion going on a weekly basis. Once a week, there was this class, and each lecturer got a turn to lead out in the discussion. And my turn came along, and silly me, I thought, I'm going to ask these questions and see what happens. I never expected what was going to happen. So I'm going to tell you what some of the questions were. This is now a long time ago. This is 39 years ago. So I cannot even vouch that the questions are exactly as they were there, but more or less these were the questions. You read in Exodus chapter 20, in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and he rested on the seventh day. Now, that already is a no-no if you're a scientist. And this is even more of a no-no. And behold, I, even I, do bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh wherein is the breath of life from under heaven, and everything that is in the earth shall die. So the scripture talks about a universal flood that will destroy everything. Now, science cannot afford a universal flood because that would mean that all life had evolved to the point of humanity. Now you're going to destroy everything, and then you would have to start the evolutionary process all over again, right? So that makes no sense. So science can never admit to a universal flood. So science will admit to what we call catastrophism, because there's a lot of evidence that all the fossils are buried in watery graves, in mud flows. So obviously there was catastrophism, and they were buried rapidly because they were covered so quickly that they were cut off from oxygen so that they wouldn't rot away and decay into nothing, but could actually fossilize. So science will admit to regional floods. And those scientists that still have a foot in religion will admit that maybe there was a time when there was a guy called Noah, maybe, and maybe he did build a boat to save some of the animals. Now, that's the stupidest theory in the whole world. Why would you build an ark to save animals if the flood is regional and the animals survive somewhere else anyway? So that doesn't make any sense. The whole thing is stupid. So in any case, both of those statements are negated by science. You can't have them. So science says, no divine foot in the door. You can only have a naturalistic explanation of where you come from, because anything else that is theistic is contrary to science. In fact, you are told that you cannot believe in God and be a scientist at the same time. That's how far it goes. All right, so let me talk about some of the points that I wanted to discuss. Now, remember, I just put these points on the board. There was no evidence really involved except for what was known at the time. And I hadn't had any great studies whatsoever into the issue of whether creation or evolution was correct. That came later. It took me years. I went to so many paleontological sites. I was all over in the world. I went to Namibia to study the fossil beds and the petrified forests. I was on Mount Hornaday in Yellowstone National Park. I was in areas in Australia. I was everywhere in the world to study for myself what was going on here. So the first question I asked was, if the evolution of life started with low diversity and diversity increased over time, why does the fossil record show higher diversity in the past and lower diversity as time progressed? That's a pretty simple question. If life somewhere fortuitously should have evolved in some slime pond somewhere, then there would have been only that little bit of life. And then it would have had to accumulate, and there would only be little unicellular creatures maybe in the beginning. Then they would have to cluster and become multicellular organisms. Then they would have to develop organ systems. Then they would become little creatures. And diversity would increase and increase and increase. Also, everything has to start small. You can't start with an elephant. You don't have a pond and suddenly a giraffe jumps out. Boop, there he is. No, you start with a unicellular creature. So everything is very small, gets bigger and bigger and bigger and more and more and more as time goes on. So if you go back into the fossil record, you should see a very low diversity of life. And then as time progressed, you should perhaps have what we have today, great diversity. But in fact, the fossil record shows that the diversity in the past was far in excess to what we have today. Whole huge categories of creatures that existed that don't exist today. And it shows the opposite trend. So the question was very simple. Why, if evolution has to start with low diversity, why do we see the opposite in the fossil record? The second question was, if evolution of necessity should progress from small creatures to large creatures, which is also logical, as I said, you don't start evolution with the elephant and move down to the amoeba. You start with a unicellular and you move up to the elephant, right? Then why does the fossil record show the opposite? Why is everything so much bigger in the past than it is today? Why? And just to give you some examples, here are some comparisons of the sizes of the prehistoric animals and their living relatives today. So on the left there, you have the sloth, and that is supposed to be extinct for many tens of thousands of years. And there, hanging on the side, is the size of a present-day sloth. Would you agree that that is quite a size difference? Now, logically, if you take this law, there's a law in evolution which is called the law of Carroll, is that evolution starts from small to larger, which is very logical. But there's the opposite. What about the wombats? I was just in your little enclave where they have the koala bears and all the exhibits over there, and they actually stated quite plainly there on their boards that these were the sizes of the wombats in the past as compared with those living today. I mean, the size difference is enormous. Or lions. There's a female lion of the past being much larger than a male lion today, or the orangutan being more than double the size of a present one. Everything was bigger. Everything was bigger. Whether it's a capybara, that is the fossil one, this is the living one, or whether it is this creature that is very prominent also in your zoos. All of them were so much bigger in the past. Horses, sharks. I would say a fossil shark of this size compared to a fully grown great white today, it would fit into that mouth like nothing. So why was everything so much bigger in the past if evolution is supposed to operate in the opposite direction? Or crocodiles, they were massive, or bisons, whatever you take. There are some human fossils that are almost 3 meters high. And you read the scriptures and you read about all these big creatures, these big animals and large human beings. And the fossil record tells us exactly the same thing. So who's being silly now? What's happening here? The next question that I asked is really a simple one. Natural selection works by the elimination of weaker variants. So how does a mechanism that works by subtraction create more diversity? Okay, that's a mouthful. So let me explain it to you. I'll show you some pictures just now. Picture speaks 1,000 words, but let's just get this theory cleared up here a little way. Natural selection can only work on what is there. Can I compare how 2 aeroplanes fly if the 2 aeroplanes don't exist? No, right? If I want to know which one flies best that I'm designing, I must have them. They must be there. So natural selection can only work on what is there. It cannot work on what might come in the future. It has to actually exist. So if I want to know who runs faster, do you run faster or the guy next to you runs faster? What must be there? You and he must be there. Both of you must be there, or else I won't be able to figure out which one runs faster, right? So you actually have to be there. Can natural selection tell me which one is going to run faster if you were a twinkle in your father's eye and didn't exist yet? No, obviously not, right? So you have to be there. So natural selection works by eliminating weaker variants. So if I want to have a team to choose an Olympic team, and I want to have an elimination race, and the two of them start running, and the one beats the other one by 10 meters over the 100 meters, there's an elimination. The one is chosen, the other one is rejected for the Olympic team. Is that how it works, right? That's how it works. Okay, that's how natural selection works too. So if you have two variants, one is called fit, the other one is called unfit, and unfitness leads to extinction. So natural selection has to have at least two variants in order to qualify for the word selection. Now, if it's made the choice and one is chosen and one goes extinct, you went from two to what? To one. So the question is, how do you use a mechanism that makes less and less to make more and more? It's a very simple question. Science actually has an answer, but we'll come to the answer in a moment because the answer has problems in itself as well. The fourth question is rather interesting. Why do the great phyla of the biome all appear simultaneously in the fossil record, even in the oldest fossil records, namely the Cambrian, when they're supposed to have evolved sequentially? Now, let me explain this because this is mind-boggling. A phylum is the largest category of animals with similar features that you can have. So you all belong to the phylum Chordata. Are you with me? You are all chordates. Every single one of you sitting here and me, I'm a chordate. We belong to the phylum Chordata. Anything that has a rod in the back, whether it be a bony rod or whether it be a cartilaginous rod or whether it just be a fibrous rod, it doesn't matter, belongs to the chordates. So the funny little squiggly things that move around in the sea with a little rod in the back, they belong to the chordates. All the vertebrates belong to the chordates. That means every fish, every frog, every reptile, every mammal, every bird, all of those animals all belong to one group called the phylum Chordata. Massive group, would you agree? Massive. All right, then you have the phylum Arthropoda. Now, that's everything that doesn't have an internal rod or skeleton, but has an external skeleton. So every insect, every crab, every jointed-legged creature that doesn't have a skeleton but an exoskeleton, they all belong to that vast category consisting of hundreds of thousands of creatures. That's another phylum. Then you have a phylum that doesn't have an exoskeleton, it doesn't have an internal skeleton, doesn't have a rod, but consists only of muscles, muscular tissue. So that would be the phylum Mollusca. So everything that has a muscle activity, like a squid, like an octopus, like a snail, like a slug, like any one of them, they all belong to this vast category. Now, if evolution were true, then the only ones that you could have in the beginning is, let's say, the phylum Protista, which is little unicellular creatures. You would have those, maybe. One or two of them. And then they would have to become more and more. We still don't figure out how it becomes more and more, but it has to become more and more. Then it has to evolve into something else and something else and something else and something else. And eventually, over have you heard of that word before? Millions of years, you get all of these categories of creatures, and we, the super uno ones, will develop last, right? Wrong. They all appeared at exactly the same time. Now that's crazy. So the question is, how's this possible? If evolution is true, then how can the phyla appear simultaneously? That doesn't make any sense. And then people will say, all right, how do we understand evolution? Now, you don't have to know all this stuff I'm talking about. I'm just giving you some general ideas, and if you get the general picture, that's good enough. There's no exam, nothing that you have to write when you leave here. Don't care whether you remember it or not, as long as you get some principles out of this. Here's a very interesting question. In the evolutionary world, you have two sets of scientists. The Darwinists are generally gradualists. Now, what does that mean? Well, Darwin thought that animals slowly evolved from one form to another over millions of years through adaptation and natural selection. That was his theory. That's the Darwinian theory of evolution. And the old stalwarts were all called gradualists. But then a problem arose. If you're going to evolve from one form to another over millions of years, should you not find intermediaries between the change? Does that make sense? Okay. Now, where are those intermediaries? The problem is they're not there. No matter what they tell you, no matter how many of them they draw in the textbooks, the fact of the matter, and I can prove it to you, they're not there. They're not there. So gradualism has a problem, although that is the only logical way of which to conceive evolution. Where are the intermediaries? So let me give you an example. Darwin believed that whales evolved from bears. All right? That's what he believed. Many scientists today don't believe that anymore, but just to give you an idea, it's the same thing. Scientists believe today that it wasn't a bear, but more a creature that was akin to a cow. It's the same thing, whether it came from a cow or whether it came from a bear. There's a huge difference between a whale and a bear, or a whale and a cow. Would you agree? All right? There are no legs, number one. The respiratory system has totally changed. They are separated. There's not one opening for both air and food. They're separated. The limbs are gone. Fins have appeared. There's a massive long tail with a massive fin on it, and not one fossil in between. So scientists had to come up with a reason why you don't find that progression. All right. And so modern scientists, who are called neo-Darwinists, they believe in a theory that was propagated later, long after Darwin, by a man called Stephen Jay Gould. And this theory was called punctuated equilibrium. So here was my question. Why do we have to postulate punctuated equilibrium to explain away the lack of intermediary fossils when gradualism is the only plausible explanation for evolutionary fossil record? Now, that was a bomber, because half of my audience there were gradualists, the old scientists, and the younger scientists, like myself, were punctuated equilibrianists. Why? Because we knew those fossils didn't exist, those intermediaries. So we had to come up with an a priori theory as to why they didn't exist. You can't bring God into it. He doesn't exist in this theory. So what does this mean? Well, Stephen Jay Gould said, well, it works like this. There is no gradual, slow evolution over time. Everything stays at equilibrium. Nothing changes. Nothing. Stays the same. So you don't find any changes in the fossil record because it stays the same. And then you have a sudden something like climate change or something, and boom, you have punctuation and rapid change. So the elephant jumps out of the fish or whatever, you know what I mean? And you have this rapid change, boom, back to equilibrium. Now you have all these new creatures there. And because it was so rapid, there was no time to make the fossils of the in-betweens. You got it? The fact that there is this theory tells you there's a problem. Now, that put the cat amongst the pigeon, and people were highly agitated when it got to that particular point. Now, it gets even more exciting, because the next question that I put up there was, if natural selection works at the level of the phenotype, as I explained, you have to actually be there. Phenotype is what you look like, you are actually there. And not at the level of the genotype. I'll have to unpack that for you in a moment. Then how did genes, mitosis, meiosis, all these things that happen at the genetic level, how did it come into existence? Because that's not something you can test, because that's just information, but the product, the you, isn't there yet. So how did all that come into existence? So the evolutionist only has one recourse, because evolution can't work at that level because there's nothing to work on. It's just information. I'll make it clearer in a moment. So how did it come into existence? Answer is it had to be by chance. By chance. It just happened one day. Now, how can something as intricate and as complex as that come about by chance? Well, I know it's highly improbable, but given enough time, so let's add a couple of billion years, and then it can happen. So you all heard the old theory that if you have 100 monkeys typing away on a typewriter, eventually the Encyclopedia Britannica will come into being. Well, the answer is actually it'll never come into being. It'll always be chaos, and they won't even get 2 or 3 words in the right sequence by chance. So I'll come back to that in a moment. That, of course, brings up another can of worms, because there are things that happen at the genetic level, like crossing over. Now, I have to explain why this is important. You see, as I explained, natural selection makes less and less, right? But we know that there's a lot of variety around, and even within the human family, there's a lot of variety. Will the two of you that are exactly identical in every single feature please stand up? Nobody's getting up. Why not? Why are we different? Why are we different? Well, because our genetic blueprint is different, slightly different. Even in twins, it's slightly different. That's why it's different. Why are we all different? How did it come into existence? Well, that came about by chance. But how did I get more and more variety? Why don't I only have ants, but I have other creatures as well? What happened? Well, the answer is sexual reproduction came into being. And that creates the variety that we need for natural selection. But this is a bomber now. Okay. So how can we explain the evolution of 2 sexes? You see, the evolution of 2 sexes is necessary in order to create more diversity, because by mixing the genes of a father and a mother, or a male and a female, we get more diversity in the offspring. But it doesn't answer the question, where do the 2 sexes come from? It gets a bit tricky. They had to come about by chance. Do you realize the implications? All the anatomical differences that have to take place, they're vast. Nobody can tell me a woman looks exactly like a man. They're not only the anatomical differences, but all the genetic differences have to come about. The halving of the gene system, so that when 2 come together, the full complement is again created. The mechanism to halve it, how did that come into existence? And besides all of those questions, we have problems as to where did matter come from? What about the origin of the genetic code? What about irreducible complexity? What about a universal flood? What about all of those questions? So let me just, for a moment, before I get back to those other questions, tell you what science tells us where we come from. Remember what the Bible said. In the beginning, God. That's what the Bible said. If you read in other places, it says, He spoke, and it stood fast. If you read a little bit further, you want to know who spoke. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. By him were all things made, and without him was not anything made that was made, etc., 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 etc. In him was life, and the life was the light of the world. Okay, so all of that says who did it and how they did it. Spoke. Out of what? Bible tells us ex nihilo, out of nothing. That's ridiculous. Now let's listen to science. Here is one of the top physicists in the world. He is in a field called quantum physics, which tries to explain where everything came from and where matter came from. And how did the Big Bang come into existence? Now, the idea of the Big Bang was actually a Jesuit idea, just for interest's sake. So that's a Roman Catholic order that was created to destroy Protestantism. They came up with the idea of the Big Bang. And what did they say? They said, well, in the beginning, there was this primordial little spot or egg, if you want to call it that, and everything was concentrated into that, and one day it exploded. Now, what did that thing consist of? Now, modern quantum physics comes up with this idea. So let's read what this scientist has to say. So the physicist Lawrence Krauss demonstrates that the answer is nothing. And that under our current understanding of physics and contrary to traditional logic, it's not just probable that we get something out of nothing, it is absolutely inevitable. Now, I'm not talking religion, I'm talking science. I'm talking quantum physics. All right, so tell us what happened, Lawrence Krauss. Well, I'll tell you what happened. In the beginning, there was something which was called nothing. And then nothing exploded and created everything. That's science. That's science as it is taught in our institutions. Now, just a question. Is that any more or less ridiculous than God created it out of nothing? Isn't it on the same level? The Bible says God created it out of nothing. Science says nothing exploded and created everything. So it's exactly the same thing. But the one is acceptable and the other one is ridiculous. Okay. So all of the galaxies and everything that you see came from an explosion of nothing. And when nothing expanded, it created first protons, then helium, when they collided with each other. And then this gas expanded in an unending universe. And somehow the gas of the pop balloon came back upon itself through a process called gravity. It's never been demonstrated that if you pop a balloon, eventually it'll come back together again. But this is what happened, because you can't only have hydrogen and helium, you have to now change that into all the other elements. So you need atomic fusion, and that can only happen in a sun. And then the sun creates all the elements that you and I exist of, and then that sun must explode in a supernova and put all that dust out there, and this continues ad infinitum over billions and billions and billions of years, when nothing becomes everything. Okay, I have another question over here. So the evolution of molecules of life required totally different environments in which to form. So you might be able to get simple molecules if you put simple gases together like they did in this experiment over here by Stanley Miller. And they said, well, this is how organic molecules come into being. I'm not going to go into the details. The problem is that only some can form this way, and you need another environment to get some of the others, and another environment to get some of the others, and another one to get some of the others, and you can never get them to form poly structures because you need enzymes for that. So who came first? The enzyme or whatever is created by the enzyme? You have massive problems. So eventually science gets so desperate that they say it came about by panspermia. Have you heard that word before? Do you know what that means? Pan, out there somewhere, spermia forming it here, so it came from outer space. Can't happen here, so it came from outer space. Okay, that's science. That's science. You have another problem. Everything is in mirror images in this world. And if you don't believe me, then lift up your 2 feet or your 2 hands and look at them and tell me, what do you see? The one is a mirror image of the other, right? If they weren't a mirror image, you'd look very funny. Okay, so we're a mirror image, bilaterally symmetrical mirror image. Now, molecules also come in mirror images, which we call L and D in the case of amino acids or sugars or whatever. And life can only use one of them. It can't use the other one. You put one of the wrong ones in there, it's totally useless. But you need an enzyme in order to pick out the right ones. Where did the enzyme come from? Well, the enzyme consists of them, so who picked them out? So it gets very, very complicated. And what they tell you in the textbook is not as easy as they want you to believe. For this, you need totally different environments. So let's just go to science and see what I have been saying, whether it is actually so. This is an old publication already. Comes from Scientific American, and it had the heading, When Life Exploded. Excuse me, that sounds like the Big Bang, doesn't it? When life exploded. And then they will tell you that many of the phyla appeared almost simultaneously. So they admit it, except they're lying to you because they use the word almost. You should scratch that. They appeared simultaneously. Why? Because chordates were in the Cambrian explosion, and they say fast turns out to be much faster than anyone ever thought. So in other words, punctuated. There was nothing exploded, and boom, there was everything. And if the Bible says it, then it's ridiculous. But if science says it, well, then it's fine. And chordates were there from the beginning. All right, so you go to your evolution textbooks. Every school child is confronted with this. And you have these beautiful evolutionary trees about how all of the modern creatures came into existence, and they put them on a tree like this, which doesn't exist. Because you will notice that there is no intermediary fossil between any of these. In fact, a snake was a snake, was a snake, was a snake, a lizard was a lizard, was a lizard, was a lizard, a bird was a bird, was a bird, was a bird. And even if they tell you that the bird came from the reptiles, then the top scientists in the world, even the curators of the Smithsonian, will say that is nonsense. It only comes out of the mind of the scientist. So this doesn't exist in the fossil record. It's pure conjecture. Let me give you an example. I put this one together. Evolution tells us that you go from small to large. So let's assume that we go from small to large. And I want to know how the various dog species came into existence, assuming I'd never seen dogs. I only have dog skulls to work with. Well, I'd put the smallest one that sort of is weird at the bottom, and I'd say maybe everything evolved out of the Chihuahua. And then I would say, okay, what do dogs look like? Well, there are ones that have very long bodies and very short legs and have floppy ears. So I'll group the spaniels and the dachshunds and the long-haired dachshunds and the bassets on one evolutionary line and say that's how they evolved over time. And those with the upright ears and the not-so-short legs and the more stout bodies, I'll put them on this line, and eventually I'll get to the German Shepherd. And the stout dogs with the floppy ears and the heavy dogs I'll put over here, and I'll have the St. Bernard at the top. Maybe I can still shove the Pyrenean mountain dog up there. And that's how it evolved out of the Chihuahua. And because I don't know what to do with this weird-looking thing over here, I'll shove him to one side and call him an oddity. Perfectly logical. And that's how all the fossil assemblages out there come into your textbooks. Perfectly logical absolutely wrong. Why? Because all of these creatures came out of the wolf, every single one of them. So the wolf had a built-in capacity to have small creatures and large creatures and all of these assemblies in between. There's a fascinating program that has been running for many, many years with wild foxes. It was a Russian scientist, I think his name was Balayev. He started the project, and it's the longest ongoing scientific project ever in the world, by the way. It's still running today, where they took wild foxes out of the wild and started breeding with them. So they took them out, and they took the mildest and the meekest of them, and those puppies they bred with again. And then they took the mildest and the meekest, and they bred with them. The mildest and the meekest, and they carried on like this until there was a dead end. Then they'd bring the wild one back in, breed again with them to mix those genes so that they could carry on. And this project has been going on since today. Within 8 generations, they had changed the wild fox's behavior to what a normal lapdog behavior would be. Just 8 generations. The whole anatomy changed, the whole physiology changed. It was amazing. And as they progressed, guess what happened? You started where you only had this tan foxes. You started to get white foxes, black foxes, mottled foxes. You started getting them with upright ears, with floppy ears, starting to look more like a Dalmatian, for example. It's amazing. The variety that came out of those wild foxes is incredible, and they could all interbreed. So that is one kind with all of that possibility in it. It's an amazing study. So if you go to the textbooks, they'll show you the evolution of the horse from small to large. Anywhere, any book, they say the smallest one resembled a creature they called Hyracotherium. That's the rock hyrax. Excuse me, this little thing that runs in crags and lives in the little rocks and what have you. All the varieties that you have are there simultaneously, just like all the dogs. They just put them in a sequence. And they did the same with the human being. There are only 2 kinds of fossils, hominids and pithecuses, ape or human. There's nothing in between, but they will put them in a sequence like that so that you think there is something in between. There's nothing in between. They don't exist. So let me get to this genetic thing, because now it gets fascinating. So remember that the gene system is just information. Natural selection can't work there because only the outcome can be tested as to its fitness. So your phenotype, what you look like, can be tested. So your genotype cannot be tested by natural selection. Everything there happens by chance. So Dawkins wrote a book. He's the famous atheist in the world today, that British scientist who's on every news program as to how he thinks. And, I have a lot of sympathy with him because I was exactly like him. I believed exactly like he did. And he was also disenfranchised and hated religion and God, not because of what the Bible says, but because of what the theologians say. So the same situation. Now, let me give you an example. If I were to give you a book that contained all the information to build this aeroplane, then I will ask you a question. Who wrote the book? If the book contained a logical sequence of exact data as to how to build that aeroplane, and I asked you who wrote the book, what would you say? Some engineer, right? Some aeronautical engineer with vast knowledge designed an aeroplane and wrote the book as to how to do it. But when it comes to biology, who wrote the book? Remember, God doesn't exist, so who wrote the book? Chance wrote the book. Chance wrote the book. Okay, if I want to know which aeroplane flies best, I better have 2 books. And I better have 2 aeroplanes to test whether they work or not. So who wrote the books? That's the question. Who wrote the books? Now, how complicated is this book and how accurate must this book be? Well, when it comes to your genes, it's absolutely phenomenal. There you have your genes. They contain all the information as to what and who you are. Now, that information has to be taken to a factory. All right, so how's that done? They make a photocopy. You first open the page to what you want to construct, and then you make a photocopy. It's called mRNA. You take that photocopy to the factory, and you make the component. Now you have one component. You've built a wing of the airplane. Now you have another set of information as to how to build the engine. You take that to the factory, make a photocopy, send it to the factory, and they build an engine. And you take another photocopy and you send that to another aerodynamic engineering firm, and they make the wheels, and they make the this, and they make the that, and they put all these things, separate pieces. And then they bring all of that together and they assemble the aeroplane. And now we can finally put a test pilot in it to see whether the darn thing flies. Question. In terms of evolution, where did all this accuracy and information and where did all the engineering feats and all the factories come from? And how could they be tested if the aeroplane hasn't been assembled yet? Answer that one for me. Natural selection can't operate until the aeroplane is there. So who put it together? Chance. Chance. Okay. Chance puts it together. Now it gets very interesting because we have genes that code for certain things, and these genes have to be activated. And in order to activate the genes, I'll make this simple. There are switches to activate the gene, and there are substances which link to these activating centers, and they activate the genes so that they can be read and the photocopy can be made and whatever happens thereafter. Now, some genes I want to activate on a slow level, and some genes I want to activate on a fast level. And some genes I want to activate only for a time and thereafter no more. And now the problem is, where do all those extra genes come from? Let me make a simple example. The 2 lights in the front here are 2 separate lights. I want one off and one on. What must I have somewhere in the room? A switch. I must have a switch. All right. I want to be a little bit more sophisticated. I want the one on dim and the other one on bright. What must I have somewhere in the room? I must have a dimmer. Now, if I were to tell you that these lights can switch on and off and dim by themselves, what would you think I was? A moron, right? You'd think I was a moron. But here, it has to happen that way. Now, it gets even more fascinating. Some of these can actually jump around. So I can have a gene which is called a transposon, and I can take it and I can switch it over to another place. So let's say that light over there has a dimmer, and this one doesn't have a dimmer, and I have a gene to construct it. I can cut it out and put it next to the dimmer so this one will work. How did that come about? I mean, this is all very accurate stuff. Did you know that I can go from a small rat to a mega rat in one generation just by jumping a gene around? For example, the gene growth hormone. When that is activated, it produces the hormone growth hormone, and growth hormone determines how quickly you grow. Now, if that gene is next to a dimmer and is set on low, then the growth is very slow. Are you with me? If I put it next to a dimmer that is on high, then lots of growth hormone is being produced and the growth is much faster. So this is something that can happen in a generation. And now it gets even more fascinating. All the information about who you are is written in your genes. And not all the genes are active at the same time. In fact, how many cells are there in your body? Thousands of different kinds of cells, right? Did you know that they all contain exactly the same information? Your nerve cell and your muscle cell, they look totally different. They have exactly the same information. Then why is the one a muscle cell that can do that and the other one is not a muscle cell? It can think, but it can't do anything else. Why? All the genes for the nerve cell are deactivated in the muscle cell, and all the genes for muscle cell are deactivated in the nerve cell. Does that make sense? So how many switches must you have to switch on genes and switch them off? Thousands upon thousands upon thousands. Where all those genes come from? Where did they come from? All right, now here you have this system. This is fascinating. This is epigenetics. Now let me explain this to you because now it gets fascinating. Your genes are put to sleep by wrapping them around a protein which is called a histone. So this is like a book that's closed. You can't read the book. And then something has to open the book. So there's something which is called an epigenetic factor. It attaches itself and it opens up, it unwinds it so that the gene that has to be read is open and can now be read. All right? Now, what they discovered is interesting. They discovered that even your habits, even your propensities, let's say you're inclined to be a highly hyperactive, nervous type. Now, because you're constantly nervous and under stress, you produce a lot of stress hormone in your body. You produce plethoras of cortisone, for example, and you are under cortisone stress. So what does that mean? The genes that now must produce cortisone are what? They are active and they're being read all the time. They're being read all the time because they are stimulated by an epigenetic factor, and the epigenetic factor can be a chemical or be something as mundane as stress. So now you are highly stressful. Now you have a child while you are in a stressful state. Are you going to transfer that stress to your child, yes or no? The answer is yes. What if you're an alcoholic and you have to constantly get rid of the toxins, detoxify your body? So all the genes that create the detoxifying enzymes in your body are constantly active. And they have to actually do something all the time. So now you have a child, and that child has the same activity. What will it crave? Alcohol. So you've actually transferred your propensity to your child. What if you have a propensity to cancer? Let's say they say breast cancer runs in families. Yes, it does. And if you study it, breast cancer runs in family. But did you know that diets also run in families? You eat like your parents ate, like your grandparents ate, like your great-grandparents ate. You sort of inherit that. And if you have a diet that is high in oxidative fats, then you have a propensity for breast cancer. So some of the film stars say, well, I have this propensity in my family. I'm going to remove my breast so that I can't have that cancer. Read the news. That's what they do. When in actual fact, you can actually switch those genes off again by staying away from the things that trigger the activity of the gene, which is a much simpler way of dealing with it. So, for example, can lifestyle change the way in which you have propensities for certain diseases, yes or no? Yes. Now, what's interesting is that they found that within 3 or 4 generations, you can get rid of a propensity. And the scripture says, I will visit the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the 3rd and 4th generation. In other words, your habits will be transferred, but you can do something about it. You can stop the habit and stop the propensity. So that's an incredible thing. So this is so incredibly complicated and so precise. And by the way, if you just read one nucleotide too far, the whole gene doesn't make sense anymore. It has to be read in that particular sequence. So if any of this were to be read with just one letter out of sync, the whole thing would be gibberish. So how accurate must your gene system be? Fascinatingly accurate. Now they'll tell you, we know that you came from the monkeys because you share 95% of your genes with an ape. Did you know that? You share 95% of your genes with an ape. Now, they've actually mapped the genes, but they have not mapped all the controlling genes. There are millions of controlling genes as to what gets activated how. And that is what makes the difference between a human and an ape, not the equivalence of the genes, because we all have the same enzymes, we all have the same muscles, we all have the same nerve systems. Those structural genes are all the same, but what you do with them is the difference. Let me ask you a question. How many tunes can you play on a piano? Infinite. But you only have a number of keys. So what makes the difference between the tunes? The way in which you activate the keys. Isn't that so? So the difference lies in how you activate the genes. The difference lies in the controlling genes. And this is fascinating. So when they tell you that you have 95% of the genes or 96% of the ape genes, big deal. Did you know that you have 94% of a mouse genes? Did you know that you have 76% of the genes of a banana? So did we all come from the banana? You see how you can work with words and get people all excited? Well, here's another interesting thing. I hope I'm not boring you. I'm trying to show you the complexity of the situation. Something called irreducible complexity. Here's a scientific document that tells you the complexity of a simple thing like a flagella motor. A flagella motor is a motor that occurs in cells that have a flagellum. Like a sperm cell has a flagellum so it can swim. And many bacteria have a flagellum. Now, what operates that flagellum? It's a motor. And that motor consists of a very specific configuration of proteins, and it has this structure, and then it has the flagellum coming out at the top. Now, there are 2 types of motors. The one runs on hydrogen or on protons. So this is a proton motor. Then you have a very similar motor with slightly different components that runs on sodium. So to make that simple, let's call the one a diesel engine and the other one we'll call a petrol engine or a gasoline engine. 2 different motors. Now the problem is this. This complicated structure cannot evolve incrementally. You cannot, by trial and error, get the motor to work. Everything has to be there. And just to show you how complex it is, this motor has different speeds. So the flagellum can move fast, so whatever is swimming can swim fast. It can move slow. It can change from high range to low range when it goes up an obstacle or over an obstacle or around an obstacle. It can go from first gear to reverse gear. And it has various speeds of reverse gear. So it's an absolutely perfect motor. But it cannot develop incrementally. So the question is this: natural selection could never produce it because it has to be complete in that configuration with that complexity in order to work. So how does science explain its existence? How did it come into being? Chance. Chance. One day the pieces just fell together and it worked. The same with a chloroplast. This is the powerhouse that runs the entire food chain in the world. This is the green color is in the chloroplast of every plant that you have out there. And it has to have that configuration. And then you feed it with sunlight, and you feed it with water, and you feed it with carbon dioxide, and out comes carbohydrates at the bottom. It's an amazing machine. Nobody's been ever able to copy it, because then you would solve human poverty and human nutritional needs overnight. It has to have that configuration or it doesn't work. How does it come into existence? It came into existence by chance. And when the first creatures appear in the fossil record, they are exactly what they are today, just bigger and more diverse in the past than today. So an insect will be an insect, whether it has straight wings, whether it has folded wings. Obviously, if you just think logically, an insect that can fold its wings and put them in a hanger and cover them with doors is going to be more advanced than one that just has two rods. Bang. But they occur at the same time, not one after the other. Or the eye, which is so complicated with these hundreds of ommatidia that even the Hubble telescope has to be molded upon this system. That's the fossil in amber over there, absolutely perfectly formed, no intermediate before it. So how does it come into about 50 million years or 60 million years since I saw you last, and you haven't changed a bit? And there's so many other questions that I have to ask you. Let's talk about the two sexes, the anatomical differences, the genetic differences, that you have to have meiosis, in other words, the reduction of the genetic system. It has to come together. This is all done by enzymes. They have to come into pairs, half of it from your mother, half of it from your father. And then they cross over, and it starts looking like that. They cross over information so that you have more variety. So not one of your children will look the same. But they're all going to be human beings. They're not going to be frogs or cabbages, because you have this genetic system. And in the crossing over, where you cross over and you mix a little bit of dad and you mix a little bit of mom, so that you have red, let's say, is from mom and blue is from dad. So you have a little bit of blue and a little bit of red and some blue and some red, and thousands and thousands and thousands of changes with not one mistake, or else you turn up to be a cabbage. How did it come into being? How did it come into being? What about the fossil record? I could go on and on and on and on. Everything that you see in this lineage is not really what you see. What are the White Cliffs of Dover? Everything was underwater. These are fossil carbonate skeletons. I was in Slovenia at the biggest brown coal mine in the world. And it's right in the heart of Europe, up against the Alps. The biggest brown coal deposits in the world. And there's this white stuff lying there. And what does the white stuff consist of? It consists of these microskeletons, which are unicellular marine organisms. So I asked the geologist, an atheist, communist country at that stage, I said to him, pick up one of those white pieces over there in your largest coal mine in the world. And what does it consist of? He said, it consists of radiolarians. I said, wonderful. What are radiolarians? He says, it's a marine deposit. So I said, was your forest under the ocean? He went pale. He said, must have been. And I said, but what do you tell all the school children? Because the bus loads of school children come there by buses, and he takes them on a tour and tells them how the coal formed over millions of years by the trees falling over, becoming compacted, and all of this and that and the other. And I said to him, but, you know, the radiolarians prove that you're not telling the truth. It all had to come about by being compacted underwater. And he looked at me and he says, you know why I smoke so much? And I said, no, why? He says, because I have to lie so much. That's what he said to me. Those were his words. And then out of his forest, up against the Alps, you pick up these marine organisms and you ask yourself, where do all these fossil assemblages come from? How do you bury whales that they don't rot? Thousands of them in a row. How do you do it? So what is the probability of any of these things coming into existence by chance? Now, why I'm telling you this, I put these questions on the board, and now the discussion was starting. Now, in the past, there was never an argument. The punctuated equilibrianists would argue with the gradualists about how it happened and this and that and the other, but it all stayed happily within this realm. And again, one young, arrogant little lady student, an honors student, in other words, she was doing a postgraduate course, she got up in that class and she looked at the lecturers, including me, and said, when I came to this university, I was a believer, and you turned me within 3 years into an atheist. Now I understand that I've been lied to. Do you think that went down well? So what happened in that class? Fury exploded. Fury. They were so angry that some of my colleagues literally started foaming at the mouth. I was lecturing at our top university in the country with the highest rating in Africa, and I gave a lecture, and the audience divided into two as a consequence of the data which I presented. It was not this lecture. It was on the probability of a catastrophic universal flood. And one of the geologists from another university that attended got up and said, we have to take cognizance of what has been said. We have to reinvestigate it. We are not telling the students the truth. How do you think that went? Such anger I have seldom seen in my life. One of the professors of the science organizations there came to the front, walked onto the stage, and spat in my face. Okay, so my question is this. If we're just going to have a debate as to how things happened and then everything's fine. But as soon as you touch the core, the result is anger. And so I did a little parable. I said, you know, if you take a stone and you throw it down a dark alley and a dog yelps, what does that mean? Silence. I said, it means that you hit him. So why are you all yelping? It means I must have said something that hit you. Now, what did it hit? It hit your core belief. Now, if it was just a question of science, you could get up and say to me, excuse me, what you are saying is not logical because of this, that, this, or the other. But they didn't do that. They got angry and they started spitting at me. So my question to you tonight is, isn't more akin to a religion than to a science? Isn't it a belief system that is being attacked? And if so, how do I know what a belief system should look like? And what evidence can I use if I don't have any evidence other than the scientific information that I have out there? Now, as I said, there are all these religious writings. And if you go back into history and into archaeology and all of those, the only ones that are consistently corroborated are the historic stories that you have in the scriptures, whether it's talking about kingdoms that would come, whether it's talking about specific wars that took place, specific kings that ruled that nobody ever knew about until the spade of archaeology dug them up. The only ones that have consistently been corroborated are the ones that you find in Scripture. And when it comes to prophecy, it gets even more fascinating. So we'll have to investigate this a little further, and we'll talk about some of the issues tomorrow, and we'll change gears a little bit, and we'll look at how some of the belief systems actually evolved or came into being, and then we'll take it from there and see where we're heading. Is it going to be a nice ride? Is it going to be a rough ride? Or where are we going? How are we going to get there? What's going to be the outcome? These are questions everybody wants to know. Everybody knows that something in this world is terribly amiss. Would you agree? Something is terribly wrong, and nobody can really put their finger on it. So let's talk about those things, and may you be blessed as you go home. And please don't worry about all the details, just a rough idea that there's really no reason to be ashamed if you want to believe that God did it or nothing exploded and that did it. Thank you.